On the morning of October 19, 1991, a Cessna 172 registered to a charter operation out of Bend, Oregon, went down in the timber east of the Ochoco Mountains, roughly 11 miles from the nearest logging road. The pilot was a 41-year-old man named Curtis Hale. His passenger was a 36-year-old geologist named Daniel Reyes, contracted to survey a stretch of ground for a mineral claim that never got filed. When a Deschutes County search team reached the wreck on the sixth day, they found only one survivor and one body. The survivor was Curtis Hale. He was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and would not speak for the first 2 days of his recovery. He was shocked beyond words. Doctors had never seen such a case of a sturdy man being absolutely terrified.
What he eventually gave the county was not a statement in the usual sense. It was the aircraft logbook. Hale had kept the logbook with him through all 6 nights, and in the blank margins and the back pages he had written in pencil a running account of what happened at the crash site. The pages were photographed and entered into the county file. They have never been publicly released. What follows is drawn from those margins, in Hale's own words, cleaned up only where the writing ran too small to read. These are the entries as he wrote them. The crash itself I barely remember. That's the honest truth of it. We lost the engine somewhere over the ridge, and I remember looking for anything flat, and there wasn't anything flat. There was just trees, and I remember Daniel saying my name once, and then the world came up at us green and hard and everything went black. When I came to it was full light, my head was against a yoke and there was blood on my hands, my own, from a cut above my eyebrow that had already gone tacky. The plane was tilted nose down into a stand of young pine, the left wing sheared off somewhere behind us. It was quiet. That's the first thing I want to put down because it mattered later. It was so quiet. Daniel was in the right seat and he was gone. I knew it before I checked. The impact had taken him and there was nothing I could have done, and I made myself stop looking after a while because there was no use in it. I got the door open on my side and I climbed out into the trees and I stood there in the wreckage of my airplane and I listened. Nothing, no birds, no wind, just the tick of the hot engine cooling behind me and my own breathing. I want to be clear about what I was because it matters to how I read what came after. I had flown that country for 11 years. I knew the Ochocos. I had put down on rougher strips than most men would attempt and walked away. And I had spent enough nights in the backcountry to know it sounds the way you know the sounds of your own house at night. So when I say it was too quiet, I am not a city man frightened of the dark. I am a man who knew that country and the country had gone silent. And silence in that country means something is wrong. The first day I spent doing the sensible things. I got the survival kit out of the tail, water, some jerky, a space blanket, a small first aid box, a signal mirror, a flare pistol with 3 cartridges. I found the emergency beacon and I turned it on, and I told myself that the beacon was already talking to somebody, that this was a matter of hours and not days. I made a plan. I would stay with the aircraft. Everyone knows you stay with the aircraft. A plane is a big, shiny thing that shows up from the air, and a man walking through timber is nothing, is a speck, is invisible. So I would stay, and I would keep the fire going, and I would wait. I dragged what I could into a rough camp under the intact wing. I laid Daniel out as decent as I could manage and covered him. And I said a few words over him that I don't remember now. I splashed some fuel on a heap of deadfall and got a good fire lit before dark. And I sat with my back against the fuselage and I ate a little and I watched the light go out of the trees. And the country stayed quiet. I kept waiting for the ordinary sounds to come back. dusk and that timber should be alive, the little birds settling, a squirrel scolding, a jay, something. The dark should have brought the owls and the small movement of animals in the brush. There was none of it. The fire popped and I sat there, and I remember thinking that the crash had scared everything off and that it would come back by morning. That's what I told myself. The crash scared it off. I know now that the crash had nothing to do with it. The first night I heard them, though I didn't know yet there was more than one. It was late, the fire down to coals, and it came from up the slope behind me. A sound I want to describe carefully because I've turned it over 1,000 times. It was low. It came up through the ground more than through the air, if that makes sense. A sound you felt in your chest before your ears caught it. Not a howl, not a growl, something between a moan and a call, long and deliberate, and it rolled down the slope and out across the dark, and then it stopped. I sat up. I put my hand on the flare pistol without deciding to. For a long time, nothing. Then, far off to my right, down the draw, another one answered it. The same long, low call, and then quiet again. I told myself elk. I said the word out loud, actually, sitting there by the coals. Elk. It's rutting season, they bugle, they make all kinds of ungodly noise in the fall, and a man alone in the dark with a dead friend under a wing will hear a bull elk and make it into anything. Elk! I built the fire back up, and I sat awake the rest of that night with the flare pistol in my lap. And I did not hear the sound again, and by the time the sky went gray, I had almost talked myself all the way back to elk. Almost, because an elk that answers itself from two directions at once is two elk, and two elk in October don't call to each other soft and low and then go silent. Two bulls announce themselves. They scream. They want the whole mountain to know. What I'd heard had not wanted the mountain to know anything. What I'd heard had been talking, low, from one point to another, and then had chosen to stop. I didn't let myself finish that thought, not that morning. The second day, the beacon died. I don't know if the battery went or the crash had damaged it, and it only pretended to work that first day. But sometime in the night, the little light on it had gone dark, and when I picked it up and shook it and pressed everything I could press, nothing. That was a bad hour, that one. Up until then, I'd had the beacon as a kind of companion, a thing that was doing its job while I did mine, and now it was just a dead plastic box in my hands, and the timber was very large around me and very quiet. So I did the other sensible things. I laid out the signal panels from the kit in the little clearing the sheared wing had torn open. I set the flare pistol where I could reach it. I rationed the water hard because I didn't know how long this was now, and I climbed up on the fuselage a few times through the day to look and listen. And each time the country gave me nothing back. No engine drone, no far-off dogs, no people, just the green going up the slopes in every direction and the gray sky over it, and that same enormous quiet. I spent a good part of that second morning trying to reach the creek in my head, working out where it was. I could hear it, faint. Down the draw to the south, that soft sound running water makes, almost below hearing. I made myself not go for it yet. I had a little water still, and the rule when you're waiting on rescue is you don't wander, you stay with the big shiny thing that shows from the air, so I stayed. But I marked the creek in my mind, the direction of it, because I knew that when the water ran out, that draw was where I'd have to go. I also spent some of that day with Daniel, though there wasn't anything to do for him. I'd covered him and I'd said what there was to say, but I found myself going back and sitting near him, not because it helped him, but because it was the one human thing left in that clearing and I needed it. I talked to him a little, nothing worth writing, just a man talking to keep from being alone in a place that had gone too quiet. It was in the afternoon, climbing back up on the fuselage to look and listen, that I first saw one of the marks. Down in the soft ground at the edge of the clearing, in the black dirt the wing had plowed up, there was a print. I climbed down, and I went to it, and I stood over it, and I looked at it for a long time. It was a footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft dirt, deeper than my own boot went when I set it beside it, and it was longer than my boot by a good measure, and it was not a boot, and it was not a bear. Bears, I know. A bear's hind track has the toes in a curve, and the claws show, and the shape is wrong for this. This had 5 toes in a line like a man's foot, and a heel and an arch, and it was pressed so deep that whatever made it had weight on it, real weight, more than a man. And it was pointed at my camp. I stood up and I looked at the tree line where the print was headed, and there was nothing there, just the dark under the pines. And I went back to the fire and I built it up higher than I needed to. And I did not tell myself elk anymore because you cannot say elk about a footprint. I didn't have a word for it. I just knew that something had come to the edge of my clearing in the night on 2 feet, heavy, and had stood there where the print was, facing me, and had not come any closer. That was the second night I didn't sleep. The third day I understood there was more than one, and I understood they were arranged. I'd spent the morning walking the edge of the clearing, close in, never more than 50 feet from the plain, looking at the ground. And I found more of the prints, and once I started seeing them, I couldn't stop seeing them. They were all around the clearing, not in a random scatter, around. They ringed the open ground where the wreck sat, back in the trees at the edge, and every set of them pointed inward. There were different sizes. Some were that first huge one, and some were smaller, and there was one set, smaller again. And I stood there in the middle of my own clearing, and I understood that in the night, while I sat by my fire, they had stood in a ring around me in the dark trees and watched. More than one, several, spaced out around the whole clearing evenly, the way you'd post men if you wanted to be sure a thing in the middle couldn't leave without one of you seeing it. I'm not ashamed to write that I sat down in the dirt when I understood that. My legs just went. I sat down in the middle of the clearing with the wreck of my plane and my dead friend, and I understood that I was not lost in an empty wilderness waiting for rescue. I was in the middle of something. I was the thing in the middle. That third night, they let me hear them move. The call started at full dark, the same low rolling sound, but now I could hear that there were more than 2 making it. It went around, one up the slope, then one off to the right, then one behind me down the draw, then one to the left, around, the way the prints had gone around, each one calling once and going quiet. And the effect of it was that I was turning and turning by the fire, trying to face all of them. And there was no facing all of them because they were everywhere around the edge of the light. And then one of them threw something. It came out of the dark and hit the fuselage with a bang like a hammer and dropped into the firelight, and it was a rock the size of my 2 fists, and it had come from the tree line hard enough to dent the aluminum. I want to say something about that throw because I've thought about it. That rock came in flat and hard and true. It didn't lob in the way a thing falls. It was thrown by an arm that meant it, from 40 or 50 feet back in the dark, and it hit the one big surface in the clearing dead center. Whatever put that stone into my plane had aimed it. I fired the flare pistol at where it had come from. The flare went up into the trees and burned red and lit the underside of the branches. And for 1 second, I saw nothing, just trees. And then the flare died and the dark came back worse than before because now my eyes were ruined by the light. Then another stone came from a different direction, then a third, not a barrage, not like they were trying to stone me to death, but spaced out, one and then a weight, and then another, each from a new point around the ring, and each one hit the fuselage. And I understood after the third one that they weren't trying to hurt me at all. They were doing it to see to learn what the noise did to me, what the fire did, what I did when a thing came out of the dark. They were taking my measure, one stone at a time, the way you'd poke at a strange animal in a trap to see which way it jumped. Nothing else came that night. But I'd learned something, and I think they'd learned something too. I'd learned they would test the plane, would reach out and touch it, would put a hand or an arm to it and see what it did, would throw a stone across 50 feet of dark and hit what they aimed at. And they'd learned that the bright red thing I threw back didn't reach them and didn't hurt them, and that I only had a few of them, and that when it burned out, I was blind for a while after. I think about that a lot, that they noticed I went blind after the flare, because that is not a thing an animal notices. That is a thing you notice when you're already thinking about what comes next. By the fourth day, I had stopped thinking of it as a rescue situation and started thinking of it as a siege. That's the word that came to me, and it was the right word, a siege. They had me in a place, and they were around it, and they were waiting, and every night they came a little closer and pushed a little harder, and they were in no hurry at all. That's the thing I keep coming back to. They were in no hurry. Anything that meant me simple harm, that was just hungry, would have rushed the fire the first night when I was weak and stupid and half concussed. These didn't rush anything. They tested, they circled, they threw a stone and watched what I did and filed it away and came back the next night knowing more. They were waiting me out. They knew, the way you'd know about a rabbit gone to ground, that the thing in the middle couldn't stay in the middle forever. The fire would run out of wood, the man would run out of water, the man would have to come out. And they had all the nights in the world. The water was most of the way gone. I'd been careful, but 4 days is 4 days, and I was down to a few swallows. My lips were cracked and my head ached in a way that wasn't just the cut. I knew there was a creek down the draw. I could hear it faintly in the quiet, that direction, the direction one of them called from every night, and I knew that at some point I was going to have to go down there to it. And I understood, sitting by my fire on the fourth day rationing the last of the water, that the creek was the trap. They'd put one of them down by the water every single night. They weren't guarding the creek from me. They were guarding it for me. They were waiting for the water to run out up here so I'd have to come down there to them. That was the day I understood I was dealing with something that could think, not clever like a clever animal. Think, plan, set a thing up, and wait for it to work. The fourth night was the worst of the early ones. They came close, closer than they'd been. I could hear them at the very edge of the light, hear the brush move as they shifted their weight, hear that low sound almost right on top of me. And once I heard breathing, slow, heavy breathing, from just past the fire, close enough that I should have been able to see whatever was making it, and I couldn't. It stayed just past where the light died. I kept the fire roaring. I burned wood I should have saved. I sat with my back to the fuselage so nothing could come at me from behind, and I watched the dark and the dark watch back, and neither of us moved until the sky went gray. But the fourth night is also the night of the voice, and I have to put that down because it's the thing that told me for certain what I was dealing with. It came in the small hours from the tree line down toward the creek, and at first I thought I was dreaming with my eyes open the way you do when you're that far gone without sleep. It was a man's voice. It was calling. And the word it was calling was my name. Curtis. Long and drawn out, from the dark down the draw, the way you'd call for a man you were searching for. Curtis. I was on my feet before I knew it, my whole body lit up with the certainty that the searchers had come, that there were men down there in the dark looking for me, and I had my mouth open to holler back, and then it called again, and something in it was wrong. It had the shape of my name, but not the life of it. It came out flat and even and a little too slow, each part of it laid down separate. The way a thing sounds when it's copying a sound it doesn't understand the meaning of. and it came from too low to the ground, and from the exact direction the low calls had come from every night, the creek direction, the trap direction. And I stood there with my mouth open, and the cold ran all the way through me because I understood that no man was calling me. One of them was down there in the dark saying my name. It had heard me, sometime in those days, heard me talking to Daniel maybe, saying my own name aloud like a fool, keeping myself company, and it had kept the sound, and now it was giving it back to me in the dark to bring me down the draw to the water. I did not answer. God help me, I wanted to. Every exhausted piece of me wanted to walk down toward that voice and be found. But I stood at my fire, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. And after a while the voice stopped, and the low calls came instead, all around the ring. And I understood the voice had been a thing they tried and it hadn't worked, and now they were back to waiting. I have flown scared, and I have crashed, and I have sat with a dead friend, and nothing in my life has put the fear in me that my own name did, called up out of the dark in a voice that was learning to be human. The fifth morning I found the thing they'd left, and that was worse in its own way than any of the nights. I'd gone out at first light to the near edge of the clearing, the downhill side, to look for wood the way I did every morning, staying close, never past the line I'd set myself. And there in the open, in the grass, a few feet inside the tree line, in a spot I had walked past the evening before and there had been nothing there, there was something set down on the ground. Set down, not dropped, not fallen, placed, the way you'd place a thing on a table for somebody to find. It was a fish, a trout, a good-sized one, fresh, still bright, from the creek down the draw. And it had been laid out on a flat stone, straight, head one way and tail the other, deliberate as anything, right where I'd be sure to come across it in the morning light. And around it, pressed into the soft ground, were the prints, the big ones, the split-eared ones. I was sure of it by then, though I couldn't have told you how. It had come up to the very edge of my clearing in the night, past all its own rules about the fire, and it had set a fresh fish down on a stone where I would find it, and it had gone back into the dark. I stood over that fish for a long time, and I did not touch it, because I understood what it was, and understanding it was the worst thing that had happened to me yet. Worse than the voice, worse than the ring of prints. It was feeding me. It had watched me for 4 nights, and it had seen me eating, seen the little bit of food I had, seen it running out, and it had gone down to the creek and taken a fish and brought it up here and left it for me the way you'd leave scraps for a stray you were keeping alive. Not to kill me, to keep me here, fed just enough, alive just enough, while the water ran out and the wood ran out so that I would last. So that I would be here when whatever they were waiting for finally came. An animal doesn't do that. A hungry thing doesn't catch a fish and give it away. Only a mind does that. A mind that has decided you are its business now. A mind that is not in a hurry and wants to make sure the thing in the middle of the ring doesn't die too soon and cheat it of whatever it was waiting for. I thought about the way a man keeps a fish alive in a bucket. Not out of kindness, because he means to use it later. I left the fish on the stone. I couldn't have swallowed a bite of it if my life hung on it, and maybe it did, and I still couldn't. I went back to my fire, and I sat with my back to the fuselage, and I understood that I was not being hunted the way a deer is hunted, quick and done. I was being kept. And a thing that keeps you is a thing that has plans for you, and I did not want to be alive for the plans. That was the morning I stopped believing I was going to walk out of there. And it was that same day, in the full light of the afternoon, that I finally saw one of them clear. The 5th day is when I saw one of them clearly, and I have gone back and forth about whether to even write this part down, because it is the part that no one will believe. But I'm writing all of it or none of it, so. It was midday. The sun was as high as it got. and the clearing was in full light, and I had gone to the far edge of it, to the tree line on the uphill side to pull some deadfall for the fire because I was burning through it faster than I could gather it. And I bent for a branch and I straightened up, and it was standing in the trees, maybe 30 feet from me, in the shadow under the pines, and it was watching me. It was tall. That's the first thing, and I've tried to be honest with the size and not let the fear make it bigger, but it was tall, well over 7 feet, standing there, its head up level with a branch I could not have reached jumping. It was heavy through the shoulders and chest in a way that a man never is, built wide and deep, and it was covered in hair, dark hair, rust brown going to near black down its back and along its arms. But the face is what stopped me. The face was not an animal's face. There was no muzzle, no snout pushed out the way a bear or an ape has. It was a flat face, a wide, flat, almost human face, with a heavy ridge of bone across the brow that put the eyes back in shadow, and a broad, flat nose and skin on that face that was weathered and gray-brown like old wood. It looked, and I know how this reads, it looked like something that was almost a man and had gone a very different way a very long time ago. And the left ear was wrong, torn, or split, an old healed injury that had left the ear in 2 pieces, and I fixed on that split ear because it was a detail small enough to hold on to when the rest of it was too much. It did not move. I did not move. We stood there, the 2 of us, and it looked at me with those shadowed eyes, and there was nothing in the look that was afraid and nothing that was angry. It was the look you give a thing you already understand. A patient look, a look that had all the time in the world. Then it turned, without hurry, and it walked back into the timber on 2 legs, easy, its arms swinging, and the trees took it, and it was gone. I did not go back for more wood that day. I went back to the fire and I sat down, and I shook for a long time. The 5th night they nearly came in. I had almost no water left, and the last of the wood was small and the fire was low, and I think they knew it. They had watched me feed that fire for 5 nights. They had watched the wood pile beside me shrink. I am telling you, they knew, the way they'd known about the flares, the way they'd known about my name. And the 5th night they came at me like something that had done the arithmetic and liked the answer. The calls came earlier, before full dark, and there was something different in them, a shorter, faster quality, an eagerness that hadn't been there the other nights, and they closed in tight. I could hear them all around the clearing at once, close, the brush breaking as they moved, and the low sound was constant now, not one at a time, but overlapping, coming from everywhere, so that there was no direction left to face. That was the worst of it. Every other night I could turn and put my back to the plane and face the loudest of them. That night there was no loudest. There was just all of them, all around, and me turning and turning in the middle like the thing in the ring I was. Stones came in 2s and 3s and banged off the fuselage. One caught me on the shoulder, and I went down and got back up. One went past my head close enough to feel the wind of it. They were tightening. Each time the brush broke, it was a little nearer, and the ring that had held 40 feet back for 5 nights was pulling into 20, to 15, and I could hear them breathing now, that heavy, slow breath, several of them from just past the reach of the light. I got the fire up as best I could with the green wood, and it smoked and guttered and would not throw the light I needed. And I knew that when it went, I was finished, and I think they knew it too, because they pressed harder the lower it got. I fired my second-to-last flare not up into the air this time, but flat, straight into the tree line where the biggest of the sounds was. And it hit something. I heard it hit, heard a heavy grunt, and a crash of something big moving fast, and for a moment the pressure of them pulled back. And then it came right up to the edge of the firelight, the big one, the split-eared one. It stepped up to the very line where the light died, and it stood there full in the low orange glow, all 7 and more feet of it. And it looked down at me over the fire, and I had the flare pistol up with the last cartridge in it, and my hand was shaking so bad I couldn't have hit the plane. And we stayed like that. Me on the ground by my dying fire with 1 shot left. It standing over me deciding, I want to try to put down what that was like, the standing there, because it's the center of the whole thing and I've never found the words for it out loud. It was close enough that I could smell it, a heavy, wet animal smell. But under it something else, something rank and old. It was close enough that I could see it breathing, the great chest going in and out slow, not winded, not worked up, calm. And it looked down at me the way you'd look at a thing you'd already decided about. I keep saying that and I keep meaning it. There was no rage in it. If there had been rage, I think I could have understood it better. It was worse than rage. It was patience. It was a mind that had all the time in the world, looking at a man who had almost none left, and doing the sum and finding it didn't have to spend a thing to get what it wanted. I don't know why it didn't come. I have thought about it every day since, and I don't have the answer. Maybe the fire, even low, was still a line it wouldn't cross. Maybe the flare that had hit its own a moment before had put a doubt in it. Maybe, and this is the thought I can't shake, maybe it simply saw that it didn't need to. That one more night would do what a fight might cost it, because it looked at me, and it looked at the little bit of wood I had left, and it looked at the empty water container by my knee, and I swear to God it understood exactly what it was seeing. It read the whole situation off the ground around me like a man reading a page. And then it did the thing I'll never forget, the thing that told me there was somebody home behind that flat old face. It looked back at me one more time, right in my eyes, and then it stepped back. Slow, deliberate, unhurried as anything I've ever seen, back into the dark. And the pressure of all of them pulled back with it, out to the ring to wait. They were going to let the mountain do it. They didn't have to spend a thing. And the terrible part, the part I sat with the rest of that night with my last flare in my hand, was that they were right. By every measure I could see, they were right. One more night and there'd be no fire and no water, and nothing for them to do but walk in at their leisure and collect what the cold and the thirst had left them. I had run the same arithmetic they had. I had come to the same answer. The only difference between us was that they could afford to be patient about it, and I could not. The 6th day, I made my peace with dying, and then the mountain changed its mind. The water was gone, the wood was gone, but for what I could break off the young pines by hand. Green stuff that smoked and wouldn't hold a flame. I was going to have to go to the creek, and I knew what was at the creek, and I sat there in the gray morning and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said I was finished. One more night with no fire and no water, and they would simply walk in and take me, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. I wrote some of this down that morning, these pages, because I wanted there to be a record even if there was never going to be a rescue. I wrote it for whoever found the plane. I wanted somebody to know it wasn't the crash that got me. And then, in the middle of that gray afternoon, the country came back to life. I didn't understand it at first. A bird called, a single bird somewhere up the slope, an ordinary jay, and I hadn't heard a bird in 6 days, and the sound of it went through me like cold water. Then another. Then, off in the timber, the small, ordinary sounds of animals moving. A squirrel, the flush of something in the brush. The quiet was breaking. The country was filling back up with its own noise, the way it should have been all along, and I understood slow, sitting there, that the reason the country had been silent for 6 days was that the country had known what was standing in it, and now the country wasn't afraid anymore. They were leaving. I don't know why. I have never known why. Maybe 6 days was simply the length of their patience, and I had cost them enough nights that I wasn't worth another. Maybe the flare that hit one of them the night before had done real harm and they'd had enough. Maybe something in that country I'll never understand called them somewhere else. But that afternoon, the ring around me lifted. I felt it lift. The pressure I'd lived under for 6 days, the constant sense of being held in the center of something, it went, and the birds came back. And I sat in the middle of my clearing and wept like a child because I could feel that I was alone again. At dusk, just at the edge of the dark, I heard the low call one last time, far off, farther than it had ever been, up and over the ridge to the north, going away. And another answered it, farther still, and then nothing. And I understood that was them, leaving, calling to each other the way they'd called around my fire, only now the calls were moving off, thinning out and taking the silence with them. The helicopter found me the next morning. I had lit my last flare at first light, straight up, and a search bird 12 miles off saw it and came. And I stood in my clearing, waving both arms at it, and I have never in my life been so glad to see anything made by men. I want to put one thing down before I stop, and then I'll stop, because they tell me I need to rest. When the searchers came, they asked me about the marks, because there were marks all around that clearing, prints in the soft ground, a whole ring of them, and stones on the ground by the fuselage, and dents in the aluminum, and none of it was mine, and none of it was Daniel's, God rest him. And I told them what I'm telling you, and I could see them deciding, kindly, that 6 days alone with a dead man had done something to me. And I let them decide it because I was too tired to make them believe. But I know what stood in that ring. I saw it in daylight with my own eyes 30 feet from me, with its torn ear and its flat old face, and it saw me. And I know it let me live. It could have had me any of 6 nights, and it chose to wait and let the mountain do it, and then the mountain didn't. And I have never understood the last part, and I have stopped trying. There. That's all of it. That's what happened at the crash site. A search of the site by the Deschutes County team, conducted on the 6th and 7th days of October 1991, documented a number of features consistent with Hale's account, though not with his interpretation of it. Impressions were photographed in the soft ground at the perimeter of the clearing. The report describes them as, quote, of indeterminate origin, 5-toed, and larger than would be expected of a human foot, end quote, and the county declined to characterize them further. Several stones inconsistent with the local surface geology were recovered from beside the aircraft fuselage, which itself showed a number of dents to the left side that the crash investigation could not attribute to the impact. A flat stone was noted at the downhill edge of the clearing bearing the remains of a trout, which the report records without comment. There was no creek within the immediate vicinity of the crash site, the nearest running water being some distance down the draw to the south. The body of Daniel Reyes was recovered from the aircraft and released to his family. The cause of the crash was later attributed to fuel system failure. Curtis Hale recovered physically over the following weeks. He did not fly again. He never amended or retracted the account he had written in the logbook margins, and when asked about it in the one interview he gave, some years later he said only that he had written down what happened and that people could make of it what they liked. The logbook was returned to him and has not been seen since. The photographs remain in the county file.
What went on in that country for 6 days and what let Curtis Hale walk out of it, the report does not say. There is no official finding. There is only a man who went into the timber in an airplane and came out on foot 6 days later, with a story no one believed, and a ring of prints in the dirt that no one could explain. Real or fake, you decide. In the spring of 2016, a 53-year-old man named Walter Boyd began losing livestock on a parcel of private timberland he owned outside Nassau, in the southwest corner of Washington state, up against Willapa Hills. He put up trail cameras to find out what was doing it. Over the next 14 months, those cameras filled better than 200 memory cards. By the summer of 2017, Walter Boyd had pulled every camera off of his land, moved his family to his sister's place in Longview, and put the parcel up for sale at a price the county assessor called, in a note in the file, well below its market value. He never lived on it again.
What he left behind was a wooden ammunition box containing the memory cards, sorted and labeled, and a spiral notebook in which he had logged, in his own hand, the date and camera number of every capture he considered worth keeping. He gave the box and the notebook to a wildlife biologist he'd been in contact with, a man who had agreed to look at his footage and then, by Walter's account, stopped returning his calls. The notebook is where most of this comes from. Walter wrote in it the way a man writes when he's trying to keep himself calm by being orderly. Dates, camera numbers, short entries, and then, toward the end, longer ones. These are his entries, in his own words. I want to start by saying, I am not a man who believes in things. I want that on the record because of where this ends up. I spent 30 years driving a log truck. I bought the back 40 acres when I could afford it, and I ran a few head of cattle on the cleared part, and I kept the rest in timber. I am a practical man. When something started killing my stock, I did not think it was anything but a cougar or a bear, because that is what it is out here when something kills your stock. So I bought 6 trail cameras from the farm store in Astoria, and I put them up along the trails and the fence lines and the edge of the tree cover, the way you're supposed to, angled down, motion triggered, and I waited to catch my cougar. I'll say a word about the cameras themselves because it matters to how I came to believe what they showed me. These were not fancy things. They were the cheap farm store kind. The kind everybody out here runs, a plastic box with a motion sensor and an infrared flash and a slot for a card. And they don't lie and they don't imagine things and they don't get scared and make a shape into more than it is. That's the whole point of them. A camera on a tree doesn't want anything. It sits there in the cold and it triggers when something warm moves in front of it, and it writes down exactly what crossed the sensor, no more and no less. I trusted them the way you trust a thermometer. Whatever else you want to say about what I found, the cameras had no reason to find it and no way to invent it. They just wrote down what walked past. I lost the first 2 calves down in the timber before I ever got a camera up, so I knew roughly where to look. The kills weren't like a cougar's is the other thing, though I didn't want to make anything of that at first. A cougar caches what it kills, covers it, comes back to it. These calves were just gone, not dragged off in a way I could track, not eaten where they lay, gone like something had carried them off whole, and a cougar doesn't carry off a calf whole, a calf is heavy. I put that out of my mind at the time, but I put the cameras where the calves had been. The first month I caught everything but deer mostly, a lot of deer, coyotes. Once a bobcat, clean as anything, and I was glad to see it, but a bobcat wasn't taking a calf. Raccoons setting off the cameras all night. The ordinary traffic of the woods is what I caught, and none of it was killing my cattle. Then, in the second month, I got the first one, and I did not know what I was looking at, and I want to be honest that for a long time, I made it into something ordinary, because that is what you do. It was camera 4, the one down at the bottom of the property where the timber gets thick at night, and it was just a shape at the back edge of the frame past where the flash really reached. Big, upright. I looked at it and I thought, that's a man. Somebody's walking my property at night. And I got angry the way you get angry about a trespasser, and I moved that camera up higher and I put another one facing the same stretch, and I figured I'd catch whoever it was good the next time. I want to stop here and say something about that first shape, because I've gone back to that card more times than any of the others. It was too big for a man. I knew it when I saw it, and I talked myself out of it. The top of it was up level with a branch I know the height of, because I walked under that tree 100 times, and no man I've ever met stands that tall. But I needed it to be a man, so it was a man. For about 3 weeks, it was a man. The next capture on that stretch is the one that ended the man idea. And I remember exactly where I was sitting when it did. It was camera 4 again and camera 7, the new one. And they'd both triggered the same night about 40 minutes apart. And the thing in them was the same kind of thing, but it was not the same one. The first one had been heavy through the shoulders, dark. This one in the new camera was leaner and lighter colored, more of a gray through the hair, and it moved different. And I sat at my kitchen table with the 2 cards, and I understood that I was not looking at a man who kept coming back. I was looking at 2 different somethings, because a trespasser is one man. 2 of them, built different, colored different, on the same stretch of ground in the same night, moving the way these moved, is not trespassers. That was the first night I didn't sleep over it. It would not be the last. Somewhere in there, I finally got a card that answered the question I'd bought the cameras to answer, which was what was killing my stock. And the answer was worse than any cougar. It was camera 4, down in the timber, late, and it caught the big, dark one carrying something. It was up on 2 legs, moving through the frame at the back edge of the light, and it had something over its shoulder, something long and heavy that hung the way a dead weight hangs. And the size and the shape of it was a calf. It was carrying one of my calves out of the timber over its shoulder the way a man carries a feed sack, one-handed, not straining, walking easy under a weight that would have put me on the ground. And it went out of the frame into the dark toward the deep timber, and that was the card. So that was my cougar. That was what had been taking calves whole and leaving no drag mark and no cache and no kill site, because it wasn't dragging them and it wasn't eating them where they fell. It was picking them up and carrying them off on 2 legs into country I never went into. I'd wondered how a thing that big fed itself out there, and there was my answer coming off my own cattle. And I stopped running cattle on the cleared ground after that card. I told the neighbors I was getting out of the cattle business. I didn't tell them why. After that, I did the thing I do, which is I got systematic. If I had more than one of whatever this was on my land, I wanted to know how many and where and when. So I bought more cameras. I ran 12, then 18, then more than 20 by the end. And I started the notebook, and I logged everyone I was sure of, and I gave them numbers so I could keep them straight in my own head. And the count climbed. That's the part I still can't get past. Looking back at the notebook, the count just kept climbing. By late that first summer, I had passed what any patch of woods that size should have been able to hold, and that scared me in a quiet way the loud cards never did. I'd run cattle. I knew roughly what 40 acres of timber can feed, a few deer, some smaller game, and that's about the limit of it before they'd eat it bare and move on. But I was logging individual after individual, and they weren't passing through and gone. They kept turning up week after week, the same ones and new ones, and there were too many of them for the ground to feed, which meant one of 2 things. Either they were ranging far wider than my 40 acres and my land was just one stop on a much bigger round, or there were a great many more of them out there in the Willapa Hills than my few cameras were catching, and my land was catching the edge of something much larger than I'd understood. I don't know which is true. I'm not sure I want to. Either way, the count on my little notebook, 6 or 7 individuals I could tell apart, was not the whole of it. It was however many happened to cross the few trees I'd hung cameras on. The real number was out there in the dark past my cameras, and it was bigger, and there was no bottom to how much bigger it might be. By the end of that first summer, I had logged what I was confident were at least 6 distinct individuals. I could tell them apart by then, the way you learn to tell cattle apart, by size and color and the way they carried themselves. There was the big, dark one from the first night. There was the leaner gray. There was a smaller one I thought was young from the way it stayed close to the bigger ones. And there was one I noted more than the rest because it had a mark on it, a torn place on the left ear, an old split healed over, and once I'd seen that ear, I saw it again and again, more than any of the others. And I started a separate page in the notebook just for the split-eared one. I told myself it was a family group, some kind of animal, unknown to me, moving through in a family group. I could live with that. An animal, even a strange one, even a big one, is still an animal, and an animal does animal things, and you can understand it. I held on to that idea as long as I could. The card that took it away from me is the one I've thought about every day since. It was the split-eared one on camera 9, up close, closer than any of them had come to a camera before. And it was not walking through the frame. It had stopped. It was standing square in front of the camera, maybe 6 feet off, and it was looking into it, right into the lens. Not startled, not caught, not the wide, blank look an animal gives a thing that surprises it in the dark. It was studying it. Its head was tipped a little to one side, and it was looking at my camera the way I look at a thing I'm trying to figure out. And the card had it there for the better part of a minute, just looking before it reached out. I'll get to what it did, and the frame goes dark. An animal doesn't look at a camera like that. A deer looks at a camera and its eyes flash and it bolts, or it doesn't. And either way, there's nothing behind the look. This looked at my camera the way a man looks at a thing another man has made, trying to understand what it is and what it's for. And I sat with that card a long time, and the family group idea died because a family of animals passing through does not stop to study your equipment. Whatever these were, they had noticed the cameras, and they wanted to know what the cameras were. There was one night that first fall that I still don't have a place to file in my head, and I'll put it here because it's about the time they went from being caught by the cameras to doing something with them. Nearly every camera I had triggered that night inside about an hour. I know because they all timestamp, and when I laid the cards out by time, they lined up into a picture I didn't like. It started at the bottom of the property, camera 4, the far ones, a little after midnight. Then the middle cameras a bit later, then the ones higher up, all down the line, one after another up the hill over the space of an hour, like something had moved across my whole property in a sweep, front to back, and set off every camera in turn as it came. But it wasn't one thing moving, because some of the cameras that triggered were a quarter mile apart and went off close enough together that one thing couldn't have been at both. It was several of them spread across the whole 40 acres moving up the hill at the same time, in a line together. And on the cards where you could see anything, they weren't hurried. They weren't running from something or chasing something. They were just moving, spread out across my land in the dark, all going the same way at the same time. And my cameras caught them doing it the way a trip line catches whatever walks through it. I sat with those cards laid out by time, and what I couldn't get past was the together of it. Deer don't move like that. Deer scatter. This was coordinated. Several big things spread wide, sweeping up the length of my property in the dark all at once, in step, and then gone by morning, and I never heard a thing through the walls of my house while it happened. Whatever they were doing that night, they did it as a group, on purpose, and my cameras were just the thing that happened to be in the way of it. Once they'd noticed, it changed. I can lay it out in the notebook, the change, camera by camera, week by week, because I logged it. And looking at it laid out that way is worse than any single card. At first, only the split-eared one did it, the stopping, the looking. Camera 9, then camera 3, then camera 11, always the same one by its ear, coming up close and studying the camera and moving on. And I thought, all right, that one's curious, that one's smarter than the rest. Every group has one like that. But then the leaner gray one did it. Same behavior, exact same. Came up close to camera 6, stopped square in front of it, tipped its head, looked into the lens a long while, and moved on. And a week after that, the big, dark one did it at camera 15. And then a smaller one, I hadn't logged doing it before. They were all doing it, one at a time, spread over weeks. But every one of them, in turn, came and stood in front of a camera and studied it. And I sat at my table with the notebook, and I understood something I did not want to understand. They were teaching each other. The split-eared one had found the cameras first. It had figured out that these things on the trees were watching, were something to be understood. And then, one by one, the others had come and looked, and I don't know how you pass a thing like that between animals except that you don't. Animals don't do that. That is not a thing animals do. Whatever was on my land was showing each other my cameras, was passing the knowing of them around. I have tried for a year to think of another explanation for why they'd all take up the exact same new behavior one after another in sequence, and I have not found one. There's one card from that stretch that I've never been able to put down, and it's the one that made the teaching real to me, not a theory, but a thing I watched happen. It was camera 15 up the middle of the property, and it caught two of them at once, which was rare. They mostly moved alone past the cameras. It was the split-eared one and the leaner gray one, and they were both in the frame, close, and they were at the camera together. The split-eared one was doing the thing it did, standing square in front of the lens, close, studying it. And the gray one was behind it and a little to the side, and it was watching the split-eared one, not watching the camera, watching the other one look at the camera, the way you'd stand behind somebody who was showing you how a thing worked. And then the split-eared one reached out and put its hand near the lens, not covering it that time, just near it, the way you'd point at a thing to show it to somebody. And the gray one leaned in toward the camera, following where the other one had gestured. And the card ends there. The two of them close together at my camera, one of them showing the other one my camera. I sat with that a long time, because there is no way to watch that and still call it animals moving through. That was one of them teaching another one what my camera was. I saw it, it's on the card. One of them brought another one over and showed it the thing on the tree, and after that the second one knew and did it too, on its own, at other cameras. That's not instinct. Instinct doesn't work in sequence like that, one learning from another and passing it on. That's the thing people do. That's the thing I do. And I watch something that isn't supposed to exist do it on my own equipment, and I have never been the same since I saw it. The reaching started after the studying. That's the order of it in the notebook, and the order matters. Once they understood the cameras were watching, they started touching them. The split-eared one first, of course. That card I mentioned, camera 9, where it stood and looked, and then reached out, what it did was put a hand over the lens. Not knock the camera down, not smash it the way an animal would if a thing annoyed it. It put a hand across the front of the camera, slow, deliberate, and the frame goes dark, and that's the end of that card. It covered the eye. It understood the camera had an eye, and it covered the eye with its hand. And then, like the studying, the others learned it. Over the next weeks, I'd pull cards and find captures that ended the same way. A shape coming up close, a hand across the lens, dark. Different individuals, the same act. They had learned from each other that the way to stop the camera seeing was to cover its eye, and they were doing it, all of them. And I was going through batteries and cards for footage that ended in a palm over the lens. I moved cameras higher. They found them. I hid cameras in the brush, off the trails, in places I wouldn't have thought to look myself. They found those too. However I placed them, within a few days something would come up to that camera in the night and study it and cover its eye. I could not put a camera anywhere on my own land that they did not find within a week. And I started to understand that meant they were looking for them. They were going over my property, deliberately finding my cameras one after another. They knew the cameras were mine. They knew a new one when it appeared. They were keeping track of my watching the way I was trying to keep track of theirs. It became a thing between us, is how it started to feel, and I know how that sounds. A back and forth. I'd put a camera somewhere clever, and for a night or two, it'd catch them moving natural, not knowing, and then one of them would find it and stand in front of it and study it and cover it, and I'd move it, and it'd happen again, like they were answering me. Like every camera I set was a question, and covering its eye was the answer, and the answer was always the same. We see it, we know what it is, we know it's yours. I got so I dreaded pulling the cards. That's a thing I should say plain because it's the truth of that whole winter. When I started, going to check the cameras was the best part of my day. The little thrill of not knowing what I'd caught, like Christmas morning every morning. By that winter, it was the worst part. I'd walk out to a camera not wanting to know, because I never knew anymore if I'd caught them being animals, which I could stand, or caught them doing one of the new things, the studying, the covering, the arranging, which I could not stand, because every one of the new things was them being a little more like people and a little less like anything that ought to be out in those woods. And the card in my hand walking back to the house was a coin I didn't want to flip. I'd sit in the truck sometimes a long while before I put a card in the reader, just holding it, not wanting to see. Then one of them moved a camera, and that was different, and that was worse. It was camera 12 on the fence line, and I went to pull the card, and the camera wasn't pointed where I'd left it. It had been turned, not knocked crooked, not fallen, turned deliberately to face a different direction. And when I looked at the card, I understood why. The last captures on it were of the camera being moved. A hand on it, the frame swinging, and then it settled, pointed a new way, and kept shooting. They had turned my camera to point where they wanted it to point, and where they'd pointed it was at another one of my cameras. I want to be clear about that because it took me a while to even understand what I was seeing. They had turned camera 12 to face camera 16 across the clearing. They had aimed my own camera at my own camera. I have never known what that was. Whether it was a thing they understood, one eye looking at another eye, some joke I'll never get, or whether it meant nothing and I'm a man finding shapes in clouds. But they turned it, and they aimed it, and it was not random, because a random knock doesn't leave a camera level, and focused on the only other camera in the clearing. After that, the moving became another thing they all did. I'd find cameras turned. Cameras set down facing trees. Once a camera taken off its tree entirely and set on the ground, upright, pointed up, and it caught nothing after that but the branches and the sky, night after night of branches and sky until the battery died. They were arranging my cameras, doing something with them I could not read, and every card I pulled that whole stretch I was pulling with my hands not quite steady, because I never knew what the last frames were going to show. I have to put down the description now of the split-eared one, because by this point in the notebook, I'd seen it enough times, close enough that I could tell you what it was, and I think whoever reads this should know what I was dealing with. It stood over 7 feet. I don't say that loose. I could measure it against the trees I knew, and it stood over 7 feet. and it was broad with it, heavy through the chest and shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with fat, deep and wide and thick like the animal was built out of hardwood. It was covered in hair, dark, a rust brown that went to near black down the back and the arms, and where the hair thinned at the face, the skin under it was a weathered gray-brown, like old wood left out in the weather. And the face was the thing. It was not an ape's face. There was no muzzle, no snout pushed out in front. It was flat, a wide, flat face with a heavy shelf of bone across the brow that kept the eyes back in shadow, and a broad, flat nose, and something in the whole set of it that was almost a man's face and not a man's face at all, like a road that forked off from ours a very long way back and never came near it again. And the ear, the left ear, split down through into two pieces, healed pale at the edges of the tear, old. That ear is how I knew it across a year of cards. And the reason the ear matters, the reason I keep coming back to it, is that I watched that ear the whole 14 months, and over 14 months I watched the animal it belonged to get older. That's a thing I don't think I can make anyone feel who wasn't sitting where I was sitting, going through those cards in order. You could see it age. Over 14 months, the split-eared one moved a little heavier, a little stiffer in the cold months. The hair went grayer at the shoulders. It favored one leg toward the end that it hadn't favored at the start. I watched a thing that most of the world says doesn't exist grow older on my own trail cameras, month by month. The way you'd watch a dog you'd had for years start to slow down. And there's no faking that, and no mistaking it. And it did more to convince me these were real, living things than any single dramatic card ever could. I can put a date on the leg. It was the cold snap in January, the second winter, and there's a card from camera 8 where the split-eared one comes through the snow, and you can see it favoring the right hind leg, setting it down careful, taking the weight slow. And after that, it favored it on every card. Before that January, it moved even, both sides. After, it limped. Something happened to it out there in that cold, some fall or some fight, or just the years catching a body that had a lot of years on it, and I watched it happen across a few weeks of cards, the way you'd watch it happen to a person you saw every day. You don't fake a limp that shows up on a certain date and never goes away. A hoax doesn't age its own monster. But this one aged and hurt and kept going because it was alive and it was old and it lived on my land. They lived out there. They got old out there. This one had been getting old out there a long time before it ever found my cameras. The last stretch of the notebook is harder to read, my own writing, because by then I wasn't calm anymore and I'd stopped pretending to be. The captures had been getting closer to the house. I want to lay that out plain because it's the shape of the whole ending. When I started, all the captures were down at the bottom of the property in the thick timber. Camera 4, the far cameras. That's where the cattle were being killed, and that's where I expected the traffic. But over the 14 months, the captures walked up the hill. Toward the house, camera by camera, month by month, the individuals showed up nearer the cleared ground, nearer the barn, nearer the yard. Not all at once, the way a tide comes in. And I only saw it when I laid the notebook out and looked at where the dated captures actually were, and saw that they had been moving toward me the whole time. There was a night in the spring near the end that I have to put down because it was the first time one of them came right up into the yard while I was in the house, and it changed the fear from a thing on cards to a thing outside my walls. I had put a camera up on the barn by then, facing the yard, because the captures had been creeping up the hill and I wanted to know if they were reaching the cleared ground. And one morning I pulled that card and there was the split-eared one in my yard at night, standing between the barn and the house. In the open, out of the timber entirely, standing on the mowed grass, maybe 60 feet from where I'd been asleep. It wasn't moving through. It was standing, the way they stood in front of the cameras, still facing the house. And the timestamp on it was a night I remembered because the dog had barked around 2 a.m. and then stopped sudden, the way a dog stops when it decides not to bark anymore. And I'd rolled over and gone back to sleep. That was the night. While I slept, it had come up out of the timber and stood in my yard and looked at my house. And the only reason I knew was the camera and the dog that thought better of barking. After that, I brought the dog inside at night and I started sleeping bad. I'd lie there and think about how many nights it had been in the yard that I didn't have a camera to catch. How many times it had stood on that grass looking at the house before I ever put a camera on the barn to see it. The cameras only showed me where I'd pointed them, and every place I pointed one closer to the house, it showed me they were already there. My wife knew something was wrong with me by then, though I hadn't told her the whole of it, because how do you tell your wife the thing I'd have had to tell her? She just saw that I'd gone quiet and I wasn't sleeping and I'd stopped going down into the timber at all, me who'd bought the place for the timber. She asked me more than once what was on the cameras that had me like that. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit her down and tell her that the things on our land were carrying off calves on 2 legs and studying my cameras and teaching each other and creeping up the hill toward the house, because saying it out loud to her would have made it real in the house, in the kitchen, at the table. And I wanted the house to stay the one place it wasn't real. So I told her it was a cougar and I was dealing with it. I lied to my wife to keep the thing out of my kitchen, and it walked up into the yard anyway. By the last month, I was getting captures on the camera I'd put up on the barn, which is inside the yard, which is 100 feet from my back door. And on a second camera I put on the corner of the house itself, facing the drive, I got the split-eared one crossing the drive one night, unhurried, like it had somewhere it was going. And the somewhere was the back of my house. And then came the card that took me off that land, and I'll write down what was on it, and then I think I'm done writing. It was a camera I had not put up. I want to be as clear about this as I can be. I ran a lot of cameras. I logged all of them by number in this notebook where each one was. And one morning I found a capture coming off a camera at an angle I did not recognize, showing a stretch of my yard from a spot I had never mounted a camera. I walked out to where the angle said it had to be, and there was one of my cameras, one that had gone missing off the bottom of the property weeks before, one I'd written off as knocked into the brush. It was up in a tree at the edge of my yard, mounted, pointed at my house, pointed at my back door and the window over the kitchen sink, at the height a person stands. I did not mount that camera. I did not carry it up the hill. It had been taken from the bottom of my property where it went missing, and it had been carried up to my yard, and it had been fixed in a tree at the right height, pointed at the window I stand at every morning. And when I pulled the card and looked at what it had been shooting my house. For I don't know how many nights one of my own cameras had been sitting in a tree in my yard that I didn't put it in, watching my house. And the only thing that had ever touched that camera besides me was them. I went through that card frame by frame, every capture on it, because I had to know how long. And what it showed, over the nights it had been up there that I never knew about, was my house. My kitchen light coming on in the dark of the morning when I got up. My shape at the window over the sink where I stand with my coffee every single morning and look out at the yard. The camera had caught me at the window morning after morning doing the exact thing I do, and something had put that camera exactly where it needed to be to catch me doing it. It hadn't been aimed at the yard or the door or the drive. It had been aimed at me. At the one spot in that house where I stand still, in the light, every day, at the same time, where anything that had watched the house long enough would know to find me. They had watched me long enough to know that. That's the thing that stood my hair up and has never quite let it down since. To put the camera there, in that tree, at that height, pointed at that window, something had to have already learned my habits, had to have watched the house from the timber night after night and worked out that the man comes to that window every morning, and then gone and got one of my own cameras from the bottom of the land and carried it up and mounted it to catch the thing it had learned about me. That is not curiosity anymore. That is study. The same study they'd given the cameras, they'd turned on me, and I never felt it happen. They had taken one of my eyes and turned it around. All that time, I thought I was the one watching. I was cataloging them, numbering them, keeping my careful notebook of what they did. And somewhere in there, it had turned around without my knowing, and they were watching me with my own camera from a tree in my own yard, at the window where I stand. Everything I'd learned about them in 14 months, they'd been learning about me right back. And they were better at it, because I never once caught them at it until they wanted me to. And I think they did want me to. I think a thing that careful doesn't leave that camera where I'd find it by accident. I think they let me find it. I think it was the answer to all my cameras, the last answer, the one that ended it. We see you too. We have been seeing you the whole time. I pulled every camera off that land the next day. I did not go back down into the timber to get the far ones. I left them. I took my family to my sister's and I put the place up for sale, and I have not spent a night on it since. And I will not. And if that makes me a coward, then I am a coward who sleeps at night, which I did not do the last month on that land. That's all of it. That's what the cameras caught. I've given the cards in this notebook to the biologist, and I hope he does something with them. And I hope somebody who knows more than I do can tell me what I spent 14 months watching and what spent the last of it watching me back. The wildlife biologist to whom Walter Boyd delivered the ammunition box did examine at least part of its contents. In a brief written assessment that later found its way into the county file along with a notebook, he described the recovered images as, quote, of undetermined origin, showing a large bipedal mammal not readily identifiable, end quote, and recommended the material be submitted for further analysis. According to Walter Boyd's own account, that further analysis never happened. The biologist, who had been eager and responsive in their early correspondence, grew harder to reach over the weeks he held the cards and then ceased contact altogether. Boyd's letters went unanswered. The box was eventually returned to him by mail without a note, and the recommendation for further analysis was never acted upon by anyone. Whether the man simply lost interest or found something in the cards he did not wish to be associated with, or had some other reason, the file does not say, and Boyd never learned. The cards came back and the silence stayed. What the notebook documents, taken at face value, is a sequence. Candid captures of multiple large individuals, followed over the course of 14 months by a progression of behaviors toward the cameras themselves, approach, study, obstruction, relocation, advancing across the recorded population one individual at a time. The examiner's note does not address this progression. It addresses only the identity of the animal, which it declines to give. The camera Walter Boyd described finding in a tree at the edge of his yard, pointed at his house, is logged in the notebook by its original number, with a note of the location it had gone missing from and the date it reappeared. Whether it was moved by the means he describes or by some means he did not record, the notebook does not prove and cannot. What it records is only that the camera was where he did not put it, pointed at what he did not aim it at, and that he left his land the day after he found it.
Walter Boyd never returned to the parcel outside Nacelle. It sold the following year. What moved through its timber for 14 months and what learned over those months to find and study and finally to turn a man's cameras back on him, no one has ever identified. Real or fake, you decide. I'm Alex, and I hope you enjoyed these encounters, and if you did, please consider subscribing. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.